We were first. I should apologise in advance. I'm losing my voice, so if I begin croaking, I may have to call an early finish this. We were talking about based on a question I was asked, talking about this is a mini series, by the way. Next week, in case I forget to say, I am away next Sunday. We were talking about enforcement of religious values, and the question was, in an ideal Torah state, would we be a theocracy, rather like Iran? Would we be forcing a dress code? How are we meant to relate when we see protests there? On the one hand, we feel a little, more than a little sympathy for the victims of repressive regimes, religious or otherwise. And on the other hand, surely that's in line with Torah values, that we're meant to be enforcing the keeping of Torah mitzvahs. So I shared last week the first of all the non-controversial expressions of this idea, and then we began drifting towards the more controversial variants of this. But there's a general trend in the Mefarshim to understand that whenever something negative happens, it's negative in the sense that it's a pity we got ourselves into that situation, but it's positive in the sense that now that we're in that situation, this is the best possible outcome. So we use as an example the expulsion of Adam Rishon from Gan Eden. In many respects, in a theoretical sense, Gan Eden is a dream state where humans can just flourish and get on with whatever they're meant to be doing, and with no distractions, no perhaps internal tensions. That seems ostensibly like the ideal way to be. And of course, therefore, it's a tragedy that we were removed from Gan Eden because of the sins of Adam and Chava. On the other hand, in the context of them having sins, Gan Eden would be the worst possible place for them to be. So in a sense, it's a good thing that we're now out of Gan Eden. And we said on a psychological level, we can understand that being on an eternal holiday, whilst in theory, we could get on and do all sorts of important things. In practice, without actually struggles and tensions and difficulties of life, it's very hard to have the pressure to move forward and achieve things. So, in a sense, us being expelled from Gan Eden is a bracha, it's a good thing. It's not a bad thing, given that we're in that situation. We spoke about the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, the Churban Beis Hamikdash, and the thoughts of Rabbi Chaim Velozhiner, which is that, of course, it's a tragedy and a pity that we sinned, and therefore the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed. But post-sin, given that we're now in that situation, actually the best thing was that the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, because it's better that the fury and the anger was taken out in sticks and stones rather than us as a live Jewish people. So on one level, and this, by the way, is why there's the lightening of the atmosphere on Tisha B'Av afternoon and onto the even the day after Tisha B'Av when the Beis Hamikdash was still being burned, because there's something positive in the negativity. Now, this can just be on one level. This can simply be that the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, taking out Hashem's anger on sticks and stones. What it means on a more profound level is, as Rabbi Chaim Velozhiner explains, in essence, really, the Beis Hamikdash was already destroyed. All that was left was a shell. The building was a shell. We weren't connecting to the Beis Hamikdash in any meaningful way. So if we ask ourselves now, in our current state, would we want to build a Beis Hamikdash? When we sit down on Tisha B'Av and we bewail a loss of a Beis Hamikdash, and perhaps many of us struggle to understand what a Beis Hamikdash is, and perhaps even struggle to emotionally engage with it. In a sense, that's the point. Would we want a Beis Hamikdash? In theory, yes. It would be nice if we were, more than nice, it would be wonderful if we were in a situation where the Beis Hamikdash would offer for us a meaningful spiritual route to connect to Hashem. But in our current state, it's not a coincidence that we struggle to mourn the Beis Hamikdash. It's not a coincidence that we don't miss it, because in our current state, as the commentaries explain, we're missing the internal spirituality, the internal dynamic, which would allow us to really want a Beis Hamikdash, which would allow us to really connect through it. So in a sense, do we really want a Beis Hamikdash? No, we don't. What we really would like would be to revamp our whole relationship to life and to spirituality such that it would again become something appropriate. In a sense, it would be inappropriate for us to have a Beis Hamikdash. That the drive to ascend Har Bayis and rebuild a Beis Hamikdash is a misplaced drive, because it doesn't fit with where we're up to and what sort of people we are and what we want to be. We ask ourselves on Yom Kippur, would we really prefer a Yom Kippur standing in the Azara, aware of the Kohen Gadol going lifnei and doing all the sacrifices in the Kodesh Kodashim and bringing in the Beis Hamikdash and the Torah, the incense offered in the Kodesh Kodashim? Is that a more meaningful Yom Kippur for us, or is it more meaningful that we stand in shul and we engage in tefillah? The answer is surely the latter. The latter is more meaningful for us, because we are unable to connect to the spirituality that's on offer in the Beis Hamikdash, that's on offer there in in Yerushalayim. I mentioned that Rav Henkin takes this a little further, and he says when we sort of face the moral dichotomy or the spiritual dichotomy, what would Judaism look like had the Beis Hamikdash not been destroyed? So would still be there in Eretz Yisrael, offering korbanos, offering sacrifices. How would this fit with the 21st century? What sort of life would that be? And he says this is exactly the point. Of course it wouldn't fit with the 21st century, because you can't rewrite history and say everything else would remain the same and just tweak one detail. And if everything was the same in the 21st century, other than us having other than that we still had the Beis Hamikdash, what would it look like? It'd feel completely outmoded. It'd be completely irrelevant. It wouldn't offer any form of ruchnius or spirituality that would be relevant to us. So in a sense, we have to say, Baruch Hashem, that we don't have the Beis Hamikdash. The tragedy, in essence, isn't the lack of access to the Beis Hamikdash. It's the broader picture of understanding what's changed and how we relate to things, how we connect to Hashem, and what sorts of people we are. So these are a couple of examples of this idea. I mentioned also last week, I think, the idea that the Sanhedrin voluntarily stopped doing capital punishment many years before the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash. The Gemara says that that when the murder rate increased, they used a technical device. The halacha is that the Sanhedrin can only perform capital punishment when the Sanhedrin Agadol, the Supreme Court, is sitting in the Lishkas Hagazis in a chamber in the Beis Hamikdash, on the edge of the Beis Hamikdash, and by the Supreme Court, the Sanhedrin Agadol removing themselves, withdrawing from there, no other court was able to perform capital punishment. No other court was able to put people to death. In other words, they recognized that the death penalty was no longer appropriate. Why is it no longer appropriate? Because murder rates has increased. I mean, if capital punishment is a means to deter people, if capital punishment is a means to prevent crime, one of the two principal theories of what give courts the right to punish, it doesn't make sense. If the murder rate goes up, then surely you up your punishment. And the answer is the opposite. In our understanding, the purpose, or at least a purpose, of capital punishment is a sort of declaration of this is a fundamental evil through which people have ceased to have the right to exist. If the murder rate goes up and other people lose their sensitivity to this, then the worst thing in the world is to do capital punishment. You're just increasing murder on murder. You're just putting more people to death. You're not succeeding in delivering the message, which is the value of life or the value of Shabbos and the devastation that imposes on the human spirit when that's lost. So in summary, what I was trying to explain last week is that you can't look at things in a narrow focus and just say, look, the Torah mandates capital punishment. Torah mandates a Beis Hamikdash. The Torah says the ideal is a situation of Gan Eden. The Torah, closer to home, mandates enforced keeping of religious practice, and say, well, let's apply that in our circumstances now. You have to rather look at the bigger picture and say, in our current spiritual journey, what would be appropriate to achieve these ultimate ends? And this isn't anti-halacha or distorting halacha, because in a remarkable coincidence, in inverted commas, of history, halacha has removed from us the ability to do that. And as we shouldn't look at this and say, what's a coincidence that we don't have a Beis Hamikdash? What's a coincidence that we can't do capital punishment because we don't have a court system? What's a coincidence that we can't ascend Harabais and rebuild it? What's a coincidence that we can't enforce the observation of Torah laws? What's a pity? Wouldn't everything be better if we could do these things? The answer is no, everything wouldn't be better if we could do these things, because it's not a coincidence of history that we can't do these. The correct way to read history is to understand there's a reason why we can't do these things. The external loss of our ability to achieve this reflects an inner loss of that this is no longer an appropriate spiritual pathway for us, at least at this point in time. Could we imagine a world where that would be different? Maybe. At the moment now, this is wholly inappropriate. This wouldn't enhance spirituality where we're able to perform capital punishment. This wouldn't enhance spirituality where we're able to have a Beis Hamikdash. On the contrary, it would decrease it, and it's for that very reason that we don't have it. So that very reason that the halachic system has reflected or morphed such that based on halachic criteria we can no longer do this. I've said this before in the context of Mechias Amalek, right? Why is it, we often, theoretical case study, this is sort of the subject of endless discussion. If you discovered an Amaleki alone in a forest, vulnerable, right? Would he have a mitzvah, Timche Seicha Amalek? Now, the answer is there's profound practical and halachic reasons why we wouldn't have this mitzvah. Then the question goes, are you comfortable with, in theory, morally, would you be able to do so? Well, the whole point is that the halachic system and practical existence doesn't enable us to do so, not just because there's practical halachic impediments, but because it's reflecting an inner value over here, that no, it wouldn't feel moral for us to do so. Mechias Amalek is we can speculate and imagine what it would have been like, but we can't understand it. We don't know what it means to have a death cult of such raw evil that every member of this society, this culture, would have no right to life, would pose an imminent threat to anyone else in the Jewish people in the world, and therefore this is the appropriate thing to do. We don't understand what such thing is. We don't have the ability and confidence and clarity to declare that someone is in truth an Amaleki, is in truth someone who has lost the right to live. What would it mean to live in a world where, with no court system, with no trial, we can declare every member of a culture to be completely completely irrelevant and completely losing their right to existence and a threat to anyone else around, such that Amalek would be justified? So we shouldn't play the game of trying to say, all else being equal, would we want to restore this halachic practice? We need to look in the wider context and say, does this make sense? It's not a coincidence that history has removed the possibility of being able to achieve this. It's a reflection of the inner values and way within which we live, which has made this impractical. I heard this idea once in conversation from Rabbi Sacks. I took a group of Emmanuel students for Q&A with Rabbi Sacks, and someone asked him about the halachas of Amalek and various other such halachas, how they should be applied, whether they should be applied, why they should or shouldn't be applied. And he responded by saying the following: why is it that we don't have these halachas? There's several reasons why we don't have these halachas, including that the Gemara says an idea that Bar Sancherev or Bil Beles Omis. Sancherev came along and he stirred up the pot. Sancherev was the king, the emperor of Assyria, and he relocated. He had a policy of relocating tribes from their natural geographic homeland somewhere else in order to ensure loyalty to the empire. If you move people to different locations, they won't be able to rebel. By the way, this was the link to the story of the 10 tribes. So Sancherev didn't conquer the kingdom of Yehuda, but it conquered the vast majority of the land of Israel, the kingdom of Israel, the place where the 10 tribes were living. He exiled them. He brought in the Shomronim, the Kusim, the Kuthites, and that's a story for another day. What happened to the 10 tribes, why the Kusim, the Kuthites, were there living in Eretz Israel, and the tensions that were developed between them in the second Beis HaMikdash era, tensions between these two populations struggling over one land. So there's a halachic reason why we don't destroy Amalek, because we don't know who they are. They've been mixed up. All Rabbi Sacks added to that is that this mix-up is reflecting something more profound. It's telling us we don't know anymore what it is to have a pure culture of evil. We don't have the clarity of what the vision of evil means anymore. In fact, the truth is nowadays we struggle to deal philosophically with what pure evil is. We don't really know what pure evil is. If you meet someone who genuinely and sincerely believes that it is right to do what is clearly recognizable as evil, we don't know how to relate to that. Either we think they must have a distorted view of what good and evil is. They must believe that it's justified somehow to do this in order to defend themselves because, let's say, I don't know, they buy into such a anti-Semitic view or such a racist view that they see these people as a threat. This is self-defense. We need to kill these people. These are a danger to us. Or we label it with labels of mental health. We say this is a sociopath, a psychopath. And we don't know how to take a rational person who's choosing evil. So we're stuck between two poles. Either we can't believe that the person really is evil. Why would a person choose pure evil unless they have some distorted sense of reading of history or reality? Or there's something going wrong in their ability to read situations at all. There's something missing in their apparatus of how they navigate through life, and we'll label that a psychopath or sociopath. And that means to say we don't know what Amalek is. It's not that we happen not to encounter Amaleki because Sancherev was Bil Beles Umas. It means that it's reflecting a deeper historical truth that we don't know how to relate to this concept. We don't know what this idea is anymore. And therefore, one can't just say, in theory, were you to encounter Amaleki, would you kill them? And isn't it a pity that practical halachic considerations no longer make this possible? What this is ensuring is that the halacha and the practical considerations are reflecting an inner dimension. This halacha doesn't make sense to us anymore. We don't know how to relate to it. We don't know what it would mean. And therefore, of course, it poses an impossible moral dilemma. Of course, we would see this as the Torah asking us to do something that seems profoundly morally wrong. Sorry, yeah.
Yeah. But could you say, therefore, that the pragmatism, the historical pragmatism override the eternal truth of Torah?
One can say that historical events and the halachic mechanisms that click in, that enforce changes, are what allow flexibility within Torah to respond appropriately to changing circumstances. In other words, you have Torah Shvichsav as an ideal theoretical model. The Torah Shvichsav was written on the Sefer Torah, written in the Luchos, stored in the Oren, in the Kodesh Kodashim. It represents an abstract ideal. Then you have Torah Shval Peh, which is the application of Torah to varying scenarios and varying situations. And the Chachmei Torah Shval Peh understood how the theoretical ideal of Torah Shvichsav is meant to be applied in practice. So you have, for example, the Tanaim who state that a Beis Din that is putting people to death once every 70 years is a bloodthirsty Beis Din. Rabbi Kiva would make sure that Beis Din never puts anyone to death. So what are they doing? I mean, what about the Psukim that have capital punishment? And they're saying, in principle, capital punishment is an important message. That in principle, we bind to the idea that there can be failures of spirituality or morality that mean that someone has lost the right to life. This is a biata or a a court can declare this person is evil, and therefore needs biur, like biur chometz. They need to be disposed of. They need to be removed. In practice, however, I don't know what that would look like. In practice, I don't believe a Beis Din would ever have the clarity to be able to enforce it. The Gemara says this about Ben Sora Mura, that it's it's just to teach us things. In other words, there's the concept of an absolute value, a pure theoretical truth, and then there's the ability to apply that concept. So Bekiva is saying, I don't believe that capital punishment is something that I can apply, at least nowadays, in our times. The removal of the ability to destroy Amalek, or the tool granted to the Sanhedrin, to the Beis Din HaGadol, to the Supreme Court, to move out of the Lishkas HaGozis and thus stop lower courts being able to apply the death penalty, are mechanisms created in the armory of Torah Shval Peh in order to allow the pure abstract theoretical ideals to be expressed into how actually Klal Yisrael and the human being is living.
You're saying yes. I'm sure that you're saying yes, basically.
I'm saying that you have a world of intrinsic values and eternal absolute ideals, and then you have the application of that to an ever-changing world. And that can vary from period in history to period in history, how one applies it, absolutely. In a sense, I spoke about this when I discussed whether the Torah was in some ways written in a Middle Eastern context, in ancient Near East, in 1,000 years ago. And I said, on the one hand, this sounds like a very jazzy, controversial topic. On the other hand, it's a very boring topic. The Torah speaks about an ox scoring a cow. Everyone understands that example was given in the context of a particular situation. And everyone understands that in practical, based in Dionys and Rabbanus, you're highly unlikely ever to get something. It could happen, but it's highly unlikely to ever get such a scenario. But we draw out the principles that lie behind it, and we apply these principles to new scenarios, and therefore we'll think about how does Shosh and Agachasapara apply to me cycling down the road and then scratching someone's wing mirror of their car. So we take halachic principles, we draw them out from the eternal truths of the Torah, and we apply them to their times. We all sort of do that casually and indifferently and almost unnoticingly when it comes to Dinei Mamonos and the laws of damages and so on. Where it gets more difficult is when it comes to moral and philosophical values. There we get uncomfortable with it. But the truth is, the great thinkers I've mentioned teach us the same idea with that. And I've discussed it, I think, in the context of slavery, discussed it in the context of women in halacha. I mentioned this in the Gemara Pesachim, and this was a tshuva from Moshe Feinstein. I'm not here choosing great thinkers who are directly writing and engaging in philosophy. I'm choosing a halachist over here, and that's why I quoted Rav Henkin also. He says the Gemara says that noshim shouldn't lean; they shouldn't engage in heseba. They shouldn't lean at the seder because emas baleim aleim. The Rashbam says the fear or the awe of their husbands is on them. So Moshe Feinstein he makes two comments on this. The first thing is he says the Gemara is commenting on a social reality that emas baleim aleim, the awe, the fear of their husbands is on them, and therefore leaning would not be an appropriate demonstration of respect, and they wouldn't feel comfortable doing that. It wouldn't be derech eros, it wouldn't be a sign of freedom. So he says the Gemara is not saying this is a good thing; it's just stating the reality. This is the way it is. The Gemara is not commenting on the value of the appropriateness of such a marriage or such a lifestyle. It's just saying the way it is. The second point he makes is that from the era of the 1100s and on, that you see in many of the Ashkenazi Rishonim, The Gemara, by the way, I should mention, says that Noshim Chashuvas, important women do lean, because there was a rare woman who was Chashuv and did lean. So from the 1100s and on, the Rav Yad, the Mordechai, various Rishonim begin saying that Noshi Dodon Chashuv, saying our women are Chashuv and important, and therefore they do lean. So some form of societal shift that's taking place, in which women are nowadays, at least in medieval Ashkenaz, or Chashuv, we know something of the historical circumstances. They began engaging in business and other things, and therefore they do lean. So and then this view makes its way into Shulchan Aruch and is brought by the Mechaber and the Ramah. To what degree we do follow it, we don't follow it, but something's happened. All our women are Chashuv. So Moshe simply comments on that. So in one liner, he says it's not that the women changed, it's that the men changed. The men began being able to recognize that women are Chashuv and have as good at great abilities and as fine in minds as men. So so the halacha has to deal with the social circumstances it finds, and it has to reflect that. So again, this is I've gone from a very non-controversial expression, this dinim ominous, through to a more controversial expression of this, let's say noshim, but it's a remote mentioning, through to the most controversial thing. But again, when we say in the context of Gan Eden, no one's bothered by it. If we ask ourselves, why did God expel Adam and Chava from Gan Eden? Because he's vindictive, because he's nasty, because he doesn't want them to enjoy the good life. But it's a punishment. But why punish someone? The answer is, in truth, an appropriate punishment, not a vindictive punishment, but a punishment that serves a purpose, is really a reflection of saying, in this scenario where you have sinned, the best thing in the world for you is to leave Gan Eden. The worst thing in the world would be for you to stay there. It would be a disaster for you. So do we aspire to be back in Gan Eden? Do we aspire to rebuild the Beis HaMikdash? It depends what you mean by that. In the greater scheme of things, absolutely yes. In the reality of our current circumstances, no, there's groundwork we need to change. We can't just be the same people we are, living the same life we are, in the same culture, and think that would be a good thing. It would be the worst thing for us to move back to Gan Eden. It would be the worst thing for Klal Yisrael now to have a Beis HaMikdash. So look, there were thinkers who took this further, and I think I mentioned this in the context of the Rambam. And Rabbi Sacks' suggestions really comes from Reb Nachum Rabinovitz, in which he talks about slow change. So let's, if we apply this to Avdus and the concept of slavery. So there's really two paths we can take as to whether the Torah allows slavery. Right? It allows slavery, there were slaves. Would we, in a dream world, wish to revert back to such a situation? So there's a number of things to say. There is a school of thought that says as follows. Say, look, if you look at the halachas of slavery in the Torah, there's a lot of protections built in for slaves. We're not talking about the southern states of America, right, before the Civil War. In halacha, if a slave is beaten up by the master and is damaged, loses shein v'ayin, the slave goes free. There's no heter in halacha for a master to needlessly beat a slave. There's protection of life. A slave that runs away, it's not so simple to return the slave to the master, depending on what's going on. There's a whole phase. In fact, in halacha, an Eved Kanani achieves a gerus type state. An Eved Kanani is obligated in many of the mitzvahs of the Torah. They have to undergo a gerus of sorts, a conversion, a semi-conversion of sorts, in order to be an Eved Kanani. There's a lot of protection built in. All that is true. On the other hand, it's equally true that Avdus, the concept of slavery, does allow horrific things. If you are a fisherman living off the coast of the Ionian Sea, and one day you go out fishing and you're captured by pirates, not Jewish pirates wouldn't do this, you're captured by pirates, and you arrive in the slave markets of Jaffa, a Jew would be allowed to buy this innocent person who's been captured as a slave. That's halacha. The Jew can then give this person a wife to marry, a shifcha. This Eved then would have children who could be sold. And the Eved may be living in Beersheba in the south of Israel, and the children could be sold to the north of Israel. These are very, very difficult halachas. Let's be honest about them. They're not simple halachas at all. So there's two approaches to this. Approach number one would be that if we understood the context of the pagan world at the time, and understood what actually this nice Greek fisherman was getting up to before he was captured, and we understood the spiritual opportunities that ultimately being part of the family of Klal Yisrael would offer, we would see that somehow this was justified. If we understood what it meant to be an Eved Kanani, if we understood the spiritual roots of the Canaanite soul, someone would understand how this made sense. That's this is certainly the approach of many thinkers. The Nachum Rabinovitz, Rabbi Sacks, really putting this into the thought of the Rambam, takes a very different approach. And they say, of course, this is not an ideal. However, Torah has to. The Rambam uses the analogy. I think I've spoken about this before of lo nochem elokim derech Eretz Palestinians ki korevu. When the Jewish people left Egypt, they weren't taken through the most efficient route to the lands of Israel. And instead, they wandered through the desert. They didn't go through Palestine. Why not? Because Kikorevu is too close, Pen Yeran and Milchama, lest they see war, and they'll return to Egypt. Ask the Rambam, is it impossible? Well, what does this pasuk mean? Hashem couldn't take them through Palestine to go the most direct route to Eretz Israel. I mean, can God not do anything he wants? And the Rambam answers, HaKadosh Baruch Hashem can do anything he wants, but humans can't do anything they want. Humans take time to change. You can't leave Egypt and instantly become a people who are capable of coping with going through Palestine, with war, with going to Eretz Israel. Klal Israel takes time to adapt. That's what you'd expect when people leave in slavery and persecution. They're traumatized. It takes time for them to develop. It takes time for them to achieve things. They can't go straight to Eretz Israel. They need the recuperation period, the safety of going via Midbar. So says the Rambam. So he uses this as a mashal, an analogy, or as a midrashic interpretation, to speak about many other such scenarios. He says we couldn't go straight from, like a car can't go from 0 to 60 in 0 seconds. However good the car is, it takes some time to change. Nothing can change instantaneously. He says we couldn't go instantly into all the end goals that the Torah wants from us. So Torah sets up a system that directs us and moves us through the passage of time. The passage of time is not tens of years and hundreds of years, sometimes it's thousands of years. And the Torah has to speak to the reality of each generation, and it builds into itself a dynamic that allows a progress and a change sometimes to occur. So the Torah teaches us values that ultimately in the long run would lead to the ridding of slavery, the Tselem Elokim, the dignity of every human being, and the like. But in the short term, no, slavery was so embedded in the economy or the sociology or the culture of the society at the time. This was something that was impossible to remove. In fact, he says that if Jews weren't allowed to buy slaves, then the slaves would be sold on the pagan slave markets, where their situation was much, much, much worse. If Jews wouldn't have been allowed to buy slaves, maybe the economy couldn't have flourished, maybe they couldn't have functions in such a world. So the Torah is acquiescing to things which are cross a basic moral threshold, albeit not necessarily an ideal. Now, again, this sounds like a sort of subversive chiddush, but we're used to this idea. There's many halachas where something is allowed in halacha, and yet we understand this is not an ideal. The Gemara will talk about the idea of chumrah. It talks about lotzis b'dei shemaim, that there can be something which is allowed, but nonetheless, b'dei shemaim is not considered an ideal. It will talk about things that aren't appropriate. You can take someone to court and maintain a court case against someone and get your money's worth out of them, but you also need to think bigger. Is this appropriate? What's the financial situation of the person taken to court? What are the moral values I'm expressing? The Gemara tells stories in which very, very clear events occur. Two people are walking in the street and one crashes into the other and breaks their barrels, and one of the Amorim takes them to court. So he says, well, you're taking them to court? Like, where's your humanity? Halacha says you have a right to claim this. But there's something that you should behave beyond halacha. Surely people sometimes should look at the behave beyond halacha and ask themselves what can they aspire to in their behavior. So the Rambam is simply saying that there are things which are acceptable in halacha, and nonetheless we shouldn't see this as an ideal. Again, Rav Kook spoke about this in the context of vegetarianism. Torah allows meat, but he's of the opinion, very controversial opinion, that nonetheless it's not an ideal. That ultimately the long-term aim is to move to that. I don't want to go through every example, and I'm not claiming that any of these ideas are universally held by all thinkers. They're certainly not. But this represents a school of thought which believes that the coincidence of halacha, that we're no longer able to enslave people, doesn't just reflect a coincidence, but reflects an inner value which has an appropriateness in its expression. Does this contradict the eternity of Torah? I don't think so in the least. It's simply the application of the eternal values of the Torah to different situations. Is this potentially dangerous? Because it opens a slippery slope. Is it a can of worms? Because if we're saying this, then how do we know what to apply and what not to apply? Indeed, you're correct. But because it opens a can of worms doesn't mean it's untrue. It simply means we have to be cautious in the application. I think I may have said before, but I'll repeat this again, that there's at least 2 rules of thumb that we can use, or 3 rules of thumb that we should use when we ask ourselves about this. The first thing is, if we're running after every contemporary fad of political correctness and current intellectual norm, we're in a problem. We have to see if these ideas are ones that are sustained over the course of decades and centuries. You can't just run after every latest faddish, unthought through, superficial moral judgment and statement. The second thing is we have to work out whether this fits within the tools of halacha. It has to fit within the tools of halacha. If the Torah, if there's an instruction in the Torah that's still applicable, thou shalt not lean on Pesach or thou shalt own a slave, then we would have a different stance towards this. But there isn't. In other words, within the tools of halacha, this isn't some liberal philosophical political correctness that's saying we shouldn't own slaves. There's halachic grounds why Evet Kanani is not applicable. There's halachic grounds why Mechias Amalek is not relevant anymore. So it works within the tools of halacha. And this is why, by the way, Klal Yisrael at the end of the day, I think is always led by halachists, not by the philosophers and the Mekabalim, the mystics, the spiritual seekers. Because at the end of the day, whilst they can teach us profound ideas, we then need to ask ourselves, does it work within the system of halacha? And Torah Sheba'al Peh has the flexibility to deal with new situations. Torah Sheba'al Peh doesn't struggle to deal with innovations in science, with cloning or with thought control technology or with medical advances and so on. It deals with that, and that's the stuff of every sort of nice Shuras night share. You take some topical scientific thing and deal how does halacha deal with Google cars. Very fascinating. We don't have a problem with taking halachic principles and applying to that. And Torah shouldn't struggle and doesn't have to struggle to deal with these scenarios either. So it always has to be worked through the prism of halacha. It has to be thought through whether this is a passing fad. And has to be threshed out through. I personally recognise that it can sometimes be uncomfortable and it can sometimes leave us hanging for a time. But I don't think it's a weakness of halacha. I think it's a strength of halacha that sometimes it can be 10 years or longer of halachic debate before a consensus emerges. But we see again and again that things go through halachic debate. And after a time, the issues are thrashed out. There's she'edos shuvas, there's letters backwards and forward, there's debates amongst the poskim, and ultimately, a halachic resolution and consensus generally comes out.
The 2 points I just wanted to ask. First thing, when we daven in the Shemona Esrei, if the ultimate is, we say, Akash Baruch Hu, bring the Sefazeno Einenu,
Yes.
and with the Devir, the Beis Hamikdash.
Yes.
If you're saying that it's not part of our psyche, or we're not able to get there, it's funny that the Anshe Knesset Stadvela put that in, unless they're putting that as an optimum of where we've got to reach to. But at the end of the day, it's so far from us because we don't. How can we ask for something and like long for something when it's just out of our?
You can also long for the longing. In other words, you can recognise that we're in a world which is very different, and you can also long for the longing. The analogy I used is that of the summer holidays, right? I spoke about Gan Eden. I said that every summer holidays comes in and I've got a few weeks off work. I've got my long reading list, all the things I want to do, the sort of projects that need tidying up at home, all the things that we think we'll achieve over holiday. Generally speaking, none of them happen, or a tiny fraction, 5% of them happen. So I can recognize that the worst thing in the world for me really is to have an eternal holiday. I can recognize that where I currently am, the worst thing for humanity as a whole would be to be in Gan Eden. And I can also recognize that it's a tragedy that this is the case. Were we able to be very different sorts of people, then it'd be wonderful if we could live in an environment with no pressure and no stress. And I said that really the story of Gan Eden is trying to push us to think about this paradox. That the things that we desperately seek in life that would be awful for us, and what are the inner changes we need to make them appropriate for us. So I think we need to live a nuanced spiritual life where we can juggle both halves of these things, where we can on the one hand genuinely cry on the Tisha B'Av and mourn what we've lost, and on the other hand recognize that there's a part of me that struggles to mourn what we've lost because I'm not in a situation to reach it, and that's itself I can mourn. I can yeah.
The other point was that according to Rabbi Chaim Sonnenfeld, who wouldn't see Bismarck because he held, whatever it was, because he held them to be. So there is some by their actions, it's a manifestation of Amalek. Yes, I mean, so while there may be a mix-up, you don't know who they are, but nevertheless, if a nation comes along and manifests themselves as being this one of Mechia, surely that must be the Torah is telling you a message, and it's certainly.
So there's a significant school of thought from Rabbi Chaim Sonnenfeld through to Rav Soloveitchik, via Rav Gustman. There's serious figures, who believe that Amalek represents a culture, a way of life, a death cult. The Rambam, by the way, paskins that an Amaleki who becomes a ger toshov. That means they don't need to join the Jewish people. They simply need to accept upon themselves the Sheva mitzvahs bin enough. There's no mitzvah to destroy them. And all we're asking from Amalek is a very basic level of morality. We're not asking for anything sophisticated. So there were many thinkers who identified Amalek in the 19th and 20th century with Germany. I don't think they were saying that Germans are genetic descendants of Amalek necessarily. And I don't think they were saying that for all time Germany has to be that. There were times in history where Germany was a very hospitable home to the Jewish people. And I don't think they were saying that necessarily applies in 2022. They're saying at a particular time in history, they believe that Germany represented the manifestation of Amalek. Rav Guzman, who became a partisan in the war, is reputed in the biography. I mean, rings. He as a partisan, he did kill German soldiers, and is reputed to have said that he believed that was the key of Mechiras Amalek. So there can be times in history where this is appropriate, but the technical halachic definition of Amalek is one that we're unable to fulfill because of Bach, Sanchev, or Bilber, almost. And Rabbi Sacks, I think, very beautifully points out that this is probably representing a deeper truth, which is it's not just that we technically don't know how to identify Amalek, but we don't understand what the concept of Amalek is. There is no culture that manifests in that way. Sorry. Yes.
I have certain concerns that there are to do things that are and what I think is that a different kind of model from what you're talking about. There, the bar is being set, somebody is expected to make every effort to meet that bar. And that seems to be a different sort of model.
Okay, so halacha sets expectations on how humans should behave. It's very, very sensitive and difficult in halacha to work out how to apply halacha with people that are not ready for or are not able to keep particular halachic practice. And I'll give several examples of that. A relatively easy case, and one that's nonetheless very difficult to paskin and keeps every rabbi very busy before Yom Kippur, is applying the expectation of everyone to fast to someone who's in a situation of physical health where they are unable to fast. And sometimes it can be very hard to get the clarity that halacha needs from doctors, because doctors themselves can be unsure as to the physical ramification. How exactly do you work that out can be very difficult. It is astronomically an order of magnitude more difficult to deal with that, for example, when it comes to situations of mental health. But the very, very important child is there can be situations where, for reasons of mental health, someone is not in a situation where they can fast, because fasting can trigger, it be linked to eating disorders, it can be linked to depression, it can all sorts of things. Very, very, very difficult, much, much harder, because our understanding of mental health is sadly and tragically very far behind our understanding of physical health. When halacha has to deal with psychological issues and family and social issues, it finds it very, very hard to deal with it. And there are situations where every competent Rav will say to someone, you have to leave it to your judgment. I'm not equipped as a Rav to give a psak on this case. I can simply offer you the reassurance that you should feel able to use your common sense. I'll give you another example of this again, where it's not controversial. I'm avoiding controversial situations. Someone who has grown up in a family that was not religious, was not keeping halachas. And at some point, they re-engage in their Judaism, and they decide, I want to do more. I want to become halachic observant. And then they come to a Rav and say, okay, please, can you teach me Shulchan Aruch? And this would be the most profoundly unhealthy next step for the person to take. Let's give it a very tangible example. The person in question is a 14-year-old still living at home, where they would be unable now to eat their mother's cooking. Right, that's one extreme example. Or someone who's 25, very balanced, 30, 35, 40, very balanced stage in life. But can they instantly take on everything? So here we have a real halachic conundrum, because on the one hand, there isn't a halachic mechanism to say, no Rav owns Shulchan Aruch. There's no halachic mechanism to turn to someone and say, you don't have to keep that. On the other hand, it is obvious that for this real life human being in front of one, the worst thing in the world would be for them to take on everything in one go. This is simply not feasible. So they have to work out what a Rav can offer. Rabbinic counseling, can offer support, can offer reflection. But Rav certainly is not in a situation to give a heta. But nor should the sensible Rav give techacha to them and say, this is what you have to be doing. So someone has to work out for themselves what an appropriate way forward is that will allow spiritual and halachic growth that's balanced with their relationship with their family, their relationship with other people around them. What happens if they're married, their spouse? What happens if the two husband and wife aren't on the same page halachically? Their own inner psychological dynamics. So this is where it's very difficult. So the most I can say is if a child just post bar mitzvah is struggling with halacha, they need to, the family, the child, the parents need to sit with a competent Rav and try and work out. Sometimes within halacha itself, there's tools to deal with it. And sometimes the response has to be, you as parents and you as a child need to know your own psychological health and you need to make your own decisions. It's not always easy to give a so you're correct again. I can only, as I said before, I appreciate this conversation. It can be misused as a slippery slope. This is not an attempt, chas v'shalom, to you know, in the least way to rewrite halacha. I have no ability to do that, no desire to do so, no want to do so. That's not what we can do. But what we can say is that in the broader national picture, we have a Torah pair which it takes the eternal values and eternal halacha and through halachic mechanisms applies it to new situations. And we also have to some degree try and use that in individual cases, but these cases need to be answered on a one-by-one case. I want to just make a couple more comments. One is just an example of this, again, in a non-controversial halachic basis, of what I'm trying to say when I think that the halachic tools give rise to a more profound spiritual or religious truth. I've used this example before, but I'll use it again. 130 years ago or so, poskim in Europe and North Africa began debating electricity on Shabbos, altering electrical currents on Shabbos. They were dealing with flickering 15-watt light bulbs, and there were significant opinions on every side. After a decade or two of debate, the very clear consensus emerged as if a heavenly voice, thou shalt not trigger electrical changes on Shabbos, don't press switches on Shabbos. No one sat there with a vision of social engineering. On the contrary, arguments were put forward that allowing the use of electricity on Shabbos would make Shabbos better, would enhance Shabbos. There was no sociological or philosophical debate going on. It was a halachic debate. 130 years on, we can see that this halachic pasak is what allows Shabbos to be an electronic detox. Were it not for this, we would be messing around on social media, we'd be using our phones, would be emailing and so on. It's clear that what in the 21st century has become almost the expression of Shmira Shabbos, it was this pasak that was issued. But no one 130 years ago, when they were dealing with flickering light bulbs, dreamt of these horrible machines. No one dreamt that this is what would ensure our Shabbos was preserved. So you had, in a sense, a dry halachic working out, which somehow, and I'm a big believer in halacha, meaning I believe it has the ability to navigate situations and emerge with an outcome that reflects that which is needed in that time and in that generation. And again, I can only say there was no conspiracy theory, and it wasn't that. People often discuss, and there's room to discuss this, to what degree do sociological factors influence the psak of a posik? Really interesting question. But in this particular case, there was none of that, because no one dreamt of these things. It was a pure, dry halachic reasoning with dry debates around boina and makabah patish and all sorts of other things, mechaber and mavi and things like that. No one dreamt of the sociological circumstance around it, and yet this was the fact. I'm not saying that that the halachic mechanism that means that we can't have an Eved Kanani, we can't do Mechiras HaMolek, was put in place for sociological reasons. Not at all. It was put in place through the thinking of the poskim, through dry halachic reasons. But it's interesting to me that these sorts of moral dilemmas, almost invariably, when people ask you a point which stands out as a moral failure, in inverted commas, of Yiddishkeit, something that really is morally problematic to 21st century thinkers, like how can we, genocide of Amalek or the like, almost slavery, almost invariably, these aren't actual practical halachic questions. Because almost invariably, these are things which are eased out of the halachic system to or within the halachic system, or eased out of halachic practice. So to me, that says something. It shows that halacha is a system that somehow, you can give it philosophical explanations, mystical explanations, whatever sociological, whatever language you wish to use, but somehow or other within the workings of dry halacha, emerges something which is sustainable spiritually. I just want to make two final points because I've run out of time. The first is I was asked to comment a little bit on the current political situation in Israel. The truth is I know very little about it, meaning to say that one has to, before claims are lobbied at anyone of extremism and the like, one has to look with great care at what they say and everything else. And I'm not here defending anyone or attacking anyone. I'm simply saying that the situation in Israel is very, very complicated, and Israel is a democracy and has chosen its government. It doesn't mean I agree with everything Israeli governments do or disagree with everything, but I want to be conscious that it's very easy to criticize and hard to understand what's really going on. But what I do want to say is the following. This is a story I was once, again, forgive me if I shared this before, I was once at a petrol station in the Golan many years ago, and I got schmoozing with a guy who was on the other side of the tank filling up their petrol with me. These conversations happen very easily in Israel, and to be honest, often when I'm filling up my tank, I'll speak to the guys filling up next to me. It's interesting to meet interesting people. And I said to the person, I said hello, and he was an American, and I said, what are you doing? He said, I'm visiting. I said, are you enjoying your visit? So he said, no, not in the least. So, I'm sorry to hear that. Why not? So he said, I've come to Israel, and I came very enthusiastically, and I'm very bothered with how the Israelis treat the Arab and Palestinian population. So I go and tell Baramos, what are you talking about? They have civil rights and they have security here. And then when I was talking, the more upset he was getting, I could see. And eventually he said to me, you've misunderstood me. I'm an evangelical Christian, and I don't understand why Israel treats the Arabs so well and allows them to flourish in this country. The Torah said, this is your land. And then he began quoting to me verses of drive the Canaanites out of the lands of Israel. And I'm horrified to see how Israel is choosing the Arabs. So at this point, I began trying to explain to him why actually the comparison between the Palestinians and the Canaanites isn't so simple. And I began trying to tell him a brief version actually of this shir. And I give this simply as an example of, you can't, obviously there's profound halachic reasons why the comparison between the Canaanites and the Canaanim and the Palestinians is ridiculous. But beyond that, you can't just take Torah values, as perhaps some politicians in Israel are currently doing, and argue for that for a practical political policy in Eretz Yisrael today. And this isn't just because the United Nations won't let us, or America will withdraw support, or it'll be a diplomatic disaster. It's telling us something more profound. There's a reason it will be a diplomatic disaster. Because what it's telling us is that these are a political disaster, is that doing so would act profoundly against what we understand of morality and spirituality. But true, the Torah said it was a different world. We need to know what the context of the driving out of Canaan was at the time. But you can't just apply one narrow situation without looking at the holistic state of humanity and Klal Yisrael and so on and so forth. And again, I recognize that line I just said can be misused to justify anything and to reform Judaism. That's not my intention, because there's halachic reasons why we shouldn't be doing it. It's halachic mistake to make these comparisons. But there's a value behind that. That again, thinkers like Rav Herzog spoke about this before the foundation of the state of Israel, when they wrote to Shuvas about what would a halachic state look like, and how would we apply, what would it mean to have a state where there are or aren't rights of non-Jews in the lands of Israel. But I'm not trying to resolve every moral and halachic and national dilemma that faces us as individuals or the Jewish people. I'm simply saying that I believe that halacha has the tools to deal with it, and this isn't an expression necessarily of a b'diavad. Sometimes it's telling us something more profound about what is appropriate spiritually. The final point I want to make is I think we need to ask ourselves, ultimately, when we're interacting with a largely secular world around us, and values or there's a claim made in the name of Torah that what we need to do is enforce tznius, like in Iran, or enforce the values of Torah. Halachic claims, misapplied halachic claims are made that we have the ability to we should be forcing people to keep Shabbos, that we should be killing people who engage in lifestyles that are against halacha, because the Torah says these people aren't allowed to live, they deserve death, and so on. I think we need to ask ourselves, just on a very practical level. The fact is, all of us in this room are here because, and the Kehillah is here because we care about ruchnius, we care about spirituality. We don't buy into an idea that a human being is just material, is just biomass. We believe we have the possibility to achieve transcendence, to achieve spirituality, to touch the divine, to achieve something of infinite value. Now, all of us in the room have our own hashkafas, our own approach, our own things that we do and don't do, but then that's the commonality that we all possess within a community. We also need to recognize that we are encountering a world that's tragically, increasingly materialistic, nihilistic, in denial of any vision of transcendence about a human being. I don't mean that even in a very frum way, I just mean that in the most basic way imaginable, that there's generations of kids now coming into the world who are pumped on and on and on with a message that there's no absolute truth, there's no absolute values, there's no morality, that all we are is a bit of biomass who are here today, gone tomorrow, and therefore might as well use our short span on earth to enjoy the pleasures of life. There's this narcissistic, hedonistic, materialistic, nihilistic philosophy that's being pumped out, and the truth is it's affecting our kids, and it's affecting all of us in our own way. We all struggle to remind ourselves that we're spiritual beings, that there's things that we can achieve, that there are things that matter. And if we ask ourselves as members of Klal Yisrael who care about this and are here to try and make ourselves and others a little more transcendent, to remind people of the existence of again and again, I ask philosophically, a denial of the possibility of doing anything good, because all we are pleasure-seeking animals. we've forgotten that we have that side to ourselves, but we also have a side that wants to do the good because it's good, that wants to do that which is right because it's right, that wants to be truthful because it's truthful. And even morality now ends up in this sort of utilitarian philosophy that the only reason for doing it is because it's good for us. If we ask ourselves, if we have this message, this shlichus, this agency from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and just as humanity, this desperation which I think we should all feel to remind ourselves and others that we are transcendent beings with a spiritual side, with a potential for godliness, we have a potential for animalistic behavior, but we also have a potential for godliness, then we have to ask ourselves, how are we better able to communicate that? And I sincerely believe from the bottom of my heart that we do not make people more transcendent and more spiritual by quoting, psukim to them about who deserves to live and who deserves to die in the world. This is not just PR and diplomacy. I mean it as a fundamental truth. Our job is to try and spread a Devar Hashem that can be heard and that people can connect to, that reminds us of our ruchnius. And in a sense, that's that I feel that desperation certainly when I walk through the world, and I hope everyone in a sense feels that desperation, because that's why we're in this room, because we care about these things. And therefore we have to ask ourselves, if I care about this, am I really going the right way about delivering that message? And I say that to everyone in Climate as well.
The clearest manifestation of this, going away from transcendentalism is this climate change theory, which I think is completely historic, because it completely ignores the idea there is a God. Even man doing things for us. At the end of the day, it's not up. It won't be up to us to destroy the world.
So I don't want to comment on a particular manifestation of it, because we probably in this room would end up with a lot of debate around it. I do want to say one point though, and I'll just finish with this. What I also find interesting is, and I'm going to half disagree with you now. What I find interesting is that the campaigns driven by the teenagers, the students, that generation of some of which, I'm not even saying this is it, but some of which reflect sort of extreme left-wing values and the like. Campaigns that I on a practical level have very little agreement with. There is something special there, because they are being driven by values that in essence we agree with. There is a good behind it, and I think when dealing with teens and students, it's important to remember that at the end of the day, they're saying we want to protect the world we live in. It's not coming from a bad place. They're saying we worry about kavod habrius. There are individuals, minorities who are being profoundly negated and disrespected. They're coming from a care for autonomy. We believe in autonomy. Humans, Salam Elokim is bechira. We're meant to have autonomy. The tragedy is that it's being hijacked and distorted into a philosophy which is, as I said, is profoundly undermining and loses contact with spirituality. But I do think when we encounter people marching for causes that maybe we disagree with, pushing extreme views that we disagree with, we do need to remember that they are Tzelem Elokim, that they're expressing things which actually have in their heart values. Again, I think we would disagree with the West in the pyramid of values, exactly which values come top and which ones come second, which ones come third. But these are not values that are treif in and of in themselves. The application of the values, the extremes to which they're taken, the consequences of them are very problematic. I think that if I had to conclude with one thing, it'd be the message of the Noamei Melech of Legends, the Melech of Legends. I think we would all do better if we just went through life seeing that which was good in other people. In ourselves, let's try and be the best people we can. But in other people, every time one encounters someone who one sees as profoundly problematic in their views, see the good in them. If we can see the good in them, then maybe we can see the neshama in them. If we can see the soul in them, then maybe they can start seeing the soul in themselves, and maybe that can reignite. I know on a political level, sometimes when I take a political stance and put views in place, I'm not talking politics here, I'm talking about none of us are politicians, our own personal interaction with people. I think that if we want to touch transcendence, one of the ways of doing that is seeing the goods of the transcendent in other people, and maybe through that, them being reminded and us being reminded about the transcendent in them. To me, that's what I'll say about the current political situation in Israel, since I was asked to, and that's what I'll say about the topic of religious coercion. So I'll stop here for today, and next week, Mitzvah Hashem, I'm not here, the week after I'll be back.
Starts off when he publishes first Gemara.
Yes.
When he published the first one.
Yes.
And he said he postulated